Alright folks, today we're going to talk about the 6 areas of Japanese law. Now this is not legal advice, and this is not going to make you an expert in Japanese law, just kind of an overview of the 6 areas of law that influence life in Japan. You'll notice I'm making comparisons to US law because that's where I was trained. Number 1 is constitutional law. Now, as many of you know, and I have a video about this, the Japanese Constitution was written by the US military, by MacArthur, with some help from a woman named Beata Sirota Gordon after World War II. Article number 1 puts the emperor as a figurehead, basically, a ceremonial figure. This is very different from the US, where the president has a ceremonial role as well as an executive role. And this is more analogous to the British system, where they have a king now. I almost said queen, because I grew up in England, had a queen for a very long time. By the way, there might be an empress if there's no line of succession. So stay tuned to see what happens there. Peace Clause, Article 9. Japan's constitution has a unique renunciation of war that prohibits the maintenance of military forces for aggressive purposes. This is significantly different from the US, where military maintenance is explicitly allowed and there's no equivalent peace clause. In the US, there's more explicit power for the ability to go to war, where the president is commander-in-chief and Congress must sign off on going to war. Now, Japan does have a self-defense force. It's actually a military. It's very well maintained, very well trained, but they're a self-defense force. They only go into action if there's a direct attack on Japan, and that hasn't happened in a very long time. Now, some self-defense forces, they call them SDF for short, some self-defense forces have been set on PKOs, peacekeeping operations. Human rights. The US Constitution and Japanese Constitution provide basic human rights. Japan places a strong emphasis on the right to maintain the minimum standards of wholesome and cultured living, which is not explicitly mentioned in the US Constitution. Next, there's the Civil Code. This encompasses family law, property law, and contract law. The Japanese Civil Code has specific provisions for family, including a post-World War II revision promoting gender equality in inheritance and family roles. But it traditionally only allowed for sole custody post-divorce, differing from the US, where joint custody is more common. Now you see this, if a Japanese couple gets divorced, the mother usually automatically gets full custody of the children. Sometimes the father doesn't even see the children after this. Now, I've heard several different stories from fathers and mothers who are divorced, and the fathers usually say, like, I really like to see my kids, but, my ex doesn't allow it. The mother will usually tell an opposite story where he doesn't participate. As we all know, the truth is usually somewhere between the two stories. Property law. In Japan, the ownership of land does not automatically guarantee the ownership of the structures on the property. This allows more nuanced property rights, like leasehold land. Contract law. Japanese contracts usually include a clause about resolving issues in good faith, which is quite different from US contract law, where things are very explicitly laid out. Now, in practice, what this really means is who has the bigger hammer. So if you're negotiating with a very large company and something goes wrong and you need them as a customer and you hope to keep them as a customer, you don't sue them, because that will basically ruin your chances of working with them again. In the US, it's a little bit different, where suppliers and OEMs can sometimes get into contract disputes, sue each other, and then sign another contract for supplies. Number 3, the Penal Code. Now, this gives a lot of power to the prosecutor. Prosecutors usually participate in investigations, interrogating witnesses, interrogating suspects. It also includes the ability to decide whether to prosecute, which contrasts with the US adversarial system, where both defense and prosecution have a more balanced role. Now in Japan, I've said this in other videos, if you don't speak Japanese or you don't speak Japanese well enough to go through interrogation, they will provide an interpreter. But remember, the interpreter, they might be friendly and helpful, but they work for the police, not you. I've got another video about the criminal process in Japan. You can watch that. I put a link downstairs in the description. Under the Penal Code in Japan, sentencing can be different, but also similar to the US. A lot of first-time offenders, the emphasis is placed on rehabilitation and getting back into society. In the US, we have things like diversion or boot camp and things like that. In Japan, there's very strict punishment for crimes against the imperial family, which is quite different from US law. Number 4 is commercial code. Corporate governance. Japan traditionally had a 2-tiered board system with corporate auditors, which is distinct from the unitary system in the US, although recent reforms are moving toward more Western practices. Commercial customs. The Japanese Commercial Code allows for the application of commercial customs, which can override civil law provisions in certain commercial transactions, a flexibility that's not usually recognized in US law. Shareholder rights. This is quite different from the US as well. Historically, Japanese corporate law gave less power to shareholders compared to US law. though this is changing with recent reforms and activist shareholders taking a stake in Japanese companies. Number 5, the Code of Civil Procedure. The judicial role. Now, judges have a more active role in managing cases and can ask questions during trials, unlike the U.S., where the judge usually takes a more passive role. In the U.S., the judge is trying to more be neutral, where they're listening to the plaintiff and the defendant, trying to figure out what's going on. Settlement. Now, in Japan Commercial Code, settlement, or it's called wakai in Japanese, is usually much more emphasized. They don't want to go to trial. It's expensive, it's taxing, it's stressful, costs a lot of money that you could be putting into research or employing people. This is a huge contrast with the U.S., where settlement is encouraged but largely driven by the parties themselves. Now, appeals are very different from the U.S., where sometimes you're allowed to go back and relitigate a case. Japanese law does allow appeals, but you basically have to prove that you will win your case before you can actually go to appeal. Number 6 is the Code of Criminal Procedure. Now, this comes into action if there is a criminal trial or a criminal procedure. Japan recently introduced the lay judge system in 2009, blending elements of jury systems with professional judges, which is unique and it's very different from the U.S. So the judge and the jurors, who are just lay people, can actually take part in the decision. But in practice, they usually defer to the judge. Now, plea bargaining was introduced in Japan in 2018. It's quite different from the U.S., where this has been an ability for defendants to plea bargain for several years before Japan had this system. When I was an intern in the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office, that's Detroit, Michigan, I would usually see a case where a person stole a car and they're charged with receiving and concealing stolen property, RCSP. And if they run from the police, they're usually charged with fleeing and eluding. And usually a person like that doesn't want to get arrested, so they're charged with resisting. Now, usually the resisting in the plea bargaining process, they'll say, we'll drop the resisting arrest if you plead to stealing the car and fleeing from the police. Detention and interrogation. So I got a video about detention and interrogation in Japan. You might want to watch that. It can go up to 23 days. So 3 days for the initial arrest, 10 days to perform the investigation, and then the police can come back and say, we haven't finished our investigation yet, so we need to keep you another 10 days. Now, if a person's charged with multiple crimes, those 23 days can reset, and you can be kept in jail for another 23 days, interrogated, and interrogations can be quite intense in Japan. They don't have the same rights as a defendant in the U.S. Now, I've looked online for interrogation videos. It's one of my guilty pleasures. I love to watch these interrogation videos from the U.S., learn about the Reed technique and things like that. I got a kind of a primer when I was in the prosecutor's office, reading body language, good cop, bad cop, little things like that. Never learned the in-depth process, but it kind of helps in daily life. Japan, they're not really transparent with that. Some interrogations, if it's a major crime, like a multiple murder, things like that, they could be taped, but they're really not released on YouTube like we have in the U.S. These differences stem from Japan's civil law system, which is influenced by German and French legal traditions, contrasting with common law system in the U.S., which relies more heavily on case law and judicial precedent. Remember, these are broad strokes. Both legal systems are very complex. I can't give you a complete, in-depth description right now in a short video. So if you want to watch that video on the Japanese criminal system, I've got a video right here you can check out, and YouTube has a random video right here that they think you'll like, and they're usually right.